Okay, so again, welcome to Funding Your Graduate Education. Again, my name is Jody Devlin, Associate Director of Advising and Programs here at Beyond Barnard. And I want to start off by asking Sarah Brock, Director of Recruitment in the Division of Humanities at the University of Chicago, to go ahead and introduce herself.
Thanks, Jody. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Brock. I am the Director of Recruitment in the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago. Yes, it's an ungodly long title, but the important part is that I'm really here in my role at the University of Chicago to help support students as they're discovering different programs, identifying what kind of programs are right for them, and also the ultimate question and the reason I'm here today, helping you figure out how to fund graduate school. So I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And then Kate Jenkins, who is a Senior Associate Director of Financial Aid at the Graduate School of Arts and Science at Columbia University. Can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Thank you, Jody. So as Jody mentioned, currently I work at the Columbia Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Financial Aid Office. Previously, I worked at Columbia Business School for 9 years and NYU Law School for 9 years. So I have spent my entire 20+ year career in graduate school education, all in financial aid. So very diverse opportunities and very different funding opportunities, depending on what type of graduate school you're going to go to and what types of studies you expect to pursue. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Kate. And now we have a student representative, a graduate student, a graduate of Barnard, so a proud alum. We have Chade Quintanilla. Can you tell us a little bit about you, Chade?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chade. I'm currently in the Peter Stark Producing Program at the University of Southern California in the film school. My program is I'm just focusing on like television producing. I'm a writer, producer, also direct a little bit, and just really excited to be here. I'm even wearing my USC Cinematic Arts hat. Got to represent, so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chade. It's so good to have you all with us to talk about this important topic. So first, I want to kind of go through this chronologically. So before applying, and after being accepted and being in graduate school. So when folks are thinking about applying, and this question is particularly for Chade, what are some financial factors that you considered while thinking about attending graduate school?
Yeah, so I made the decision to attend graduate school several years after graduating undergrad. So a big part of me making the decision to go to school again was just like I saved up, had like a full-time job with a full-time salary. No longer have that now while I'm in grad school, but I had that in mind of just like really saving as much as possible as I could, and so that I could, use those funds to help fund my graduate education.
Yeah, thank you. And for Sarah and Kate, can you talk about some of the kind of conversations that you have with students as they're starting to think about attending graduate school?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially the conversations that I have with students center around identifying what types of programs fit your interests and how that changes what that financial profile might look like. A post-baccalaureate program is going to have a different financial requirement than a master's program or a PhD program, especially in, terms of where you're located. So I tend to start the conversation with what are you interested in studying? And then kind of winnowing down from there to identify like what makes sense and how we can best prepare. I also always really encourage students to start the scholarship search, especially the third-party scholarship search early, and then often, and then continuously, because those are really places that they're not tied to your status as a currently enrolled student. And so you can work, like Chade said, towards saving funding to then use later.
And in my role, I'm typically dealing with students who've already decided that they're going to attend a program, or perhaps they've been admitted or at least prospectively applying for those programs. So in some cases, it differs because the students have identified already what they would like to pursue. And so it's discussing then with them what resources they're bringing to their education versus what resources the school is able to assist them with financially. And to Sarah's point as well, encouraging students to look at external funding opportunities as early and as frequently as possible. A lot of those organizations that offer awards have timelines throughout the academic year, throughout the summer. And so that's something that, for some students, it's sort of a monthly check, the same way that they might check other things in their life.
Wow. So since you kind of already started talking about it, what are some common outside sources of financial aid for master's and PhD programs? And I'm especially thinking about the humanities versus, STEM programs, especially.
Kate, do you want to jump in first?
I could jump in first and maybe talk a little bit about some of those. That there are some funds that overlap, right? Fulbright, most folks are familiar with Fulbright, and Fulbright has opportunities in humanities, social sciences, as well as hard sciences or STEM. NSF, National Science Foundation, GRFP, those and NASA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the American Museum of Natural History, those are all common sources for students in terms of those who are looking for funding for the sciences.
Yeah, I think in terms of like other common sources outside of the institutional funding, I always like to plug, especially for the humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts. They have quite a few opportunities as well. And students that are interested in, interdisciplinary study or graduate study that might be enriched by additional foreign language study. I also encourage to look into FLAS awards, which are foreign language and area studies fellowships. Different institutions have those, not everyone does. But those can be a really great way to not necessarily always fund your academic year, but fund your study abroad programming, your before or after academic programming to help enrich that environment as well.
Thank you. So kind of on the same kind of planning note, I want you to talk, and you can all kind of talk about this, especially you, Chade, as somebody who's currently in graduate school. What are some of the hidden costs that students sometimes forget about when putting together their grad school budget?
Yeah, I think some of the hidden costs can be books that you need to purchase for classes. Sometimes programs require you to have specific programs. So like, for example, in the Stark program, we have to have a certain level of laptop. I think we have to have like Premiere Pro or Final Draft, the screenwriting software. But I will say though, sometimes programs will say that you need to purchase these things, but then when you really like think about what you're actually using for the program, you definitely do not need to pay for those things. Like for example, like if you do go have a graduate program that's requiring you to have a specific computer, I just definitely recommend like speaking to current students or past students to see if getting that computer is necessary. A MacBook costs $2,000, and if you don't really need a Mac to do the work that you need to get accomplished, then I think that's kind of like a cost you can reduce. Other costs, housing costs, cost of transportation, food, medical costs sometimes, depending on what medical services you need and what your insurance covers. And travel. I'm from LA, so that wasn't a really big cost for me, but I know travel and like moving costs are can be pretty hefty.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, relocation expenses are something that students aren't thinking about. I think there's a tendency to look at the tuition and fees and see how much of that is potentially going to be covered by a program, but you still have to be a person and live and eat and see your family maybe or friends. And so there are definitely all of those life costs that happen. There's also, for some programs, they'll indicate that they're fully funded. But to Chade's point, there could be expenses that you have that are not going to be funded. So for example, perhaps your program would cover health insurance costs at the university, but you need more extensive coverage and that might not be included. So each individual is going to need to look at their own personal budget to figure out if there are quote unquote hidden costs, or if there are just costs that perhaps the program would not cover, student activity fees or other club fees or dues that again are not part of the financial aid package that you'd receive, but are certainly still costs that you might incur.
Yeah, to echo that, I mean, for transportation, you all are in New York, I'm in Chicago. Chade, you are now in LA, and in some places we have really great public transportation services, which make moving around spaces easy, and we don't necessarily factor in the cost of our monthly MTA or CTA cards because it's easy to use. So thinking about where you're going and what the reliability of transportation costs are. Do you need a car? Can you rely on public transportation? What does that mean, and how does that influence your monthly budget? I also really like to encourage students to factor in fun to a certain extent. Like Kate said, you are a person, and being a person is more than being an academic or a graduate student broadly. So thinking about if you want to take a vacation, if you can, what does that mean? If you want to go out with friends, really thinking about budgeting for life and not just a program.
Yeah, definitely. You're a full person, you're going to meet people, you're going to want to hang out. I know, especially when it comes to business school, which nobody on the panel is from business school, but that is definitely a program that has a lot of networking kind of expenses and, stuff like that. So definitely thinking about how your 360, the 3D of it all is going to be also going to graduate school.
Yeah, my experience in the past 9 years at business school is absolutely, there's a cost that's stated for the program, and then there's another cost for actually engaging in everything that you would do as a business school student. For other programs like law, there might be course costs for sitting for a bar course or something, certification fees for exams. Those typically aren't covered by programs and potentially ineligible for certain types of financial aid. So again, even costs that would happen further down the road for your program before you complete that degree are things that you might want to consider and factor in.
I just wanted to add too on the living costs and budgeting for fun. Another way to budget for fun is especially if your program is very networking focused. Like my program, it's not technically a business program, but it's a program focused on the entertainment business. So there are a lot of events, like I'm sure at Barnard, something I actually didn't really take advantage of when I was in undergrad, going to events that are hosted by the university or events that are offered that are free. And those are really great opportunities to network, not with just your classmates, but really network across or outside of the university. And that's just really important just to establish connections beyond, the main circle that you interact with at school.
Chade, that's a really great point. Grad student mixers, there are tons of those where you can just meet other people outside. You never know when that connection is going to, not to make it career service, but you never know when that connection is going to come in handy, whether it's just as a friend or as a career connection, or, just someone to know, in this city, especially if you're moving to a new city. So thank you all. Like, that's a huge hidden cost that is important as well. Now I want to talk a little bit, or ask you a little bit, especially to Kate and Sarah. What advice, or what are some things that international students should be thinking about as they are planning for their financial costs of graduate school?
So I think that for most of you, you may have already experienced some of this as an undergrad, right? There is limited funding for international students in terms of accessing loans or accessing other types of sources. It's important for you to understand whether or not your program treats international student funding differently than domestic student funding. In some cases, one of the big hidden surprises for international students is that some of their funding is going to be taxed, and taxes will be withheld, and you think you're getting a certain amount in a stipend, and Uncle Sam takes a portion of that. Now, most institutions won't be able to provide you with any tax advice, but it's something for you to be cognizant of as you make your financial plans once you do know what funding sources are available. I think we at Columbia see a lot of students coming, international students, occasionally really coming with funding from their home country government. So NSERC from Canada, the Foundation for Overseas Resources and Development from South Korea, Sciences Po in France. There are a number of different Ministry of Education awards in various countries. And so for international students, you're looking at sources that would be similar to domestic students, US citizens and permanent residents, in terms of organizations that are based here, but you also have another resource in your home country, which is something that you should explore and avail yourself of. And again, that difference between, say, a PhD program that provides significant funding to a student versus a master's program, which may provide very little or no funding to a student, is a big difference that you want to understand.
I agree completely. I had in my notes, like, remember to mention home country assistance, because I think that's one that a lot of students are aware of, but not every student is aware of, and it's definitely worth investigating. I would also encourage students just generally, once you've identified the institutions that you're going to apply to, or you've been admitted, to reach out to the Office of International Affairs at that institution. They can tell you a little bit more specifically about what that process is, and they can tell you about the common pitfalls or the common questions that they're getting from international students. They also tend to have a pretty significant repository of different fellowships or scholarships that students have previously had or currently have, because they're tapped into that community in a way that some of our domestic recruiters or financial aid staff members aren't. So I'd encourage to go that way as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And then my last question in the sort of thinking about applying stage is, what role, if any, do standardized tests play in obtaining merit aid?
They don't play any role at the University of Chicago. For in the humanities and social sciences, for the most part, the GRE is completely optional. There are a couple of programs that still require it, but for the most part, those scores are not looked at. For business schools and law schools, those are different. They have different processes, but for the most part, the true academic, in air quotes, disciplines don't weigh as heavily with the GRE scores anymore.
Yeah, I think that, again, the idea of how the school might be defining merit for PhD programs, where if you're admitted, you're meritorious, and so you're fully funded, that's a little bit different than, to Sarah's point, business schools that are offering merit-based funds, or law schools that are offering merit-based funds, where the student's academic and test score profile might be considered. But it, again, will vary among the very different departments and schools that you're looking at.
Of course. So now let's get into the application process. And this is for everyone on the panel. I'd like for you to kind of talk a little bit about the differences between applying for financial aid as an undergrad versus as a grad student. And you can also like differentiate if you find any differences between master's and PhD students as well.
I will admit I can't remember how I applied for financial aid. I think my parents did my financial aid application when I was an undergrad. I'm coming upon like my 10-year reunion at Barnard next year, so it's been a while. But this time around, for my grad school application, I filled out the FAFSA form. The thing about grad school, specifically, I don't know if it's just my program or if it's across the board, but you typically don't get financial aid, like free aid. You get a I think grad plus or a
Loans.
grad loan. Yes,
Yeah.
a federal loan. And then you can get you get a federal loan up to I think like 20,000. I could be wrong. I'll let the experts talk about that. And then you can get an additional funding through another federal loan. So I think like when you're applying, depending on your program, sometimes they ask scholarship questions. Definitely fill out all of the sections within like the scholarship questionnaire. I made the mistake of not applying to what ended up being like one of the biggest scholarships for my program because I thought I didn't qualify or fit. I think it was like for somebody with high financial need. And I think because I had like some savings, I thought that I didn't fit within that category. But now, as not to like scare anyone, now I don't have any savings basically. So I definitely do fit in that category because grad school is expensive, especially USC. It's just a very expensive school. So I think you should definitely, like, when you're applying and you see scholarship applications, apply to all of them if you feel like you fit the category.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference in the type of federal funding that you can receive as an undergraduate student, which is very generous, and much of it is not loan-based, though there are loans for undergraduate students. Even the loans are more beneficial at the undergraduate level, where some portion of them may be subsidized. But that distinction between, as an undergrad, you're going to be asked to provide parental information as the primary determinant for your need-based scholarship or merit-based even funds. Institutions typically are going to take parental information for undergrad. At the graduate school level, it really does vary. At law schools, many schools will request parental information in order to be considered for need-based funds. Perhaps not if they have merit-based funds, but there's a big distinction in that the federal government for graduate students provides loans only. For some schools, there is access to federal work-study funding at the graduate level, but the vast majority of funds outside of the institution and outside of external fellowship and scholarship funds, federal funding is limited to loans for graduate students. And there are two types of loans. The first is called a direct unsubsidized loan, meaning interest is going to accrue throughout the time that you're in school. It's capped at an amount of $20,500 per academic year and can be supplemented with the federal graduate plus loan, which has a higher interest rate, is also unsubsidized, and requires a credit check, which is very different than any undergraduate funding that you have. So less favorable in terms of federal funding at the graduate level, but typically also a lot less information that's needed in that application, because most grad programs are not going to request parental information. On the FAFSA specifically, they wouldn't. They may have an institutional form that requires some part of that, or use like the CSS profile or another external application in order to determine any graduate-based need funds.
So I think we can move on to the next question. You kind of covered everybody, all of the different aspects. So thank you for that. I would like to know if we could talk a little bit about some of the differences, and I know that they are vast depending on the programs, but differences between master's and PhD packages, especially when it comes to STEM and the humanities again, and I guess also, well, yeah, STEM and the humanities.
Yeah, I can talk broadly. So I mean, I think there's a lot of differences, and we've hit on a couple of them so far. The biggest difference is many PhD programs, especially in highly selective institutions, are fully funded. So they're providing tuition support and a living stipend, often also covering the cost of institutional fees or student fees, whereas master's programs are self-funded. So they are programs that they might, the institution might provide some level of scholarship support, but on the whole, the vast amount of that cost is going to be your burden to bear. That's pretty true in both the humanities and the STEM fields. Some nuanced STEM fields have additional scholarship and funding or other stipend roles that might come into play just because they tend to be bigger departments on campuses. And so they need more TA support that they might turn to master's students for. But that's kind of the big difference there. I do like to talk to students at this point when they're comparing master's degree programs and PhD programs to note that not every PhD is a funded program. Different institutions offer different types of funding and have different expectations for their doctoral students. So when you're thinking about a PhD, don't immediately think that it's funded. I think that's an important note to make there. I do think the other thing that I really like to note here is that when you're looking at and comparing financial aid packages and funding packages, to remember that it's different from when you applied to undergrad, and in the ultimate cost of attendance, regardless if you're looking at a master's or a PhD program, it's not including any of that room and board, housing, living expenses. Those numbers generally are truly just tuition and student fees and occasionally health insurance. So to keep that part, like we mentioned before, in mind.
Yeah, and I wouldn't add much to that. There's definitely a difference in most large institutions, selective institutions, in terms of master's program funding, which may be very departmentally based. And so to Sarah's point, larger departments may have more funding available to them. Specific professors may have funding available to them versus PhD programs, which tend to be funded by the institution at large.
Yeah, so I imagine that you would advise students to look at the departmental page to see if there are any kind of specific scholarships, along with, applying the regular way and doing the FAFSA and things like that.
And remember, some of those external awards would be opportunities that you could avail yourself of regardless of whether you're choosing to do a master's or a PhD. So certainly, even if you haven't decided what type of program you're pursuing, you can look into some of the external sources as potential funding, regardless of whether it's a master's or PhD program.
Yeah, thinking specifically about Fulbright and some other fellowships that will fund both levels of graduate study. So you kind of already touched on this, Sarah, or you started to touch on this. I'd like to know from all of you, what are some factors that students and applicants should consider when they've received their financial aid award packages and they're starting to evaluate those offers? What factors should they be thinking about?
The first thing that I ask students to think about, and I do this at all levels, whether you're looking at undergraduate institutions or PhD programs, to consider the cost of living in the area that you have applied, because that is a major variable that changes the meaning of the numbers on your financial aid package. The cost of living in Chicago is significantly different than the cost of living in LA or in New York, and is very different than Central Illinois or Alabama. So all of that is important context that you need before you can start to decipher what the individual component parts of your financial aid award letter are. If you're getting a stipend for a PhD that's $37,000 in a state where the average cost of living is less than that, that means a lot versus if you're getting $37,000 and you're expected to live in Manhattan. Like, it's totally different. So I like to start there. There are a couple of different calculators that you can find pretty readily accessible on the internet. MarketWatch has one that is updated pretty frequently to get a sense of what the current cost of living is in the city in which you would be expected to live. From there, I really like students to try to break it down line by line. Most institutions provide information as like a lump sum. What does this mean as an ultimate or your annual cost? But how do you break that down in terms of semester or quarter if you're on the quarter system? And like looking at what your scholarship support is versus what the cost of tuition is, what the cost of fees is, what the cost of health insurance, if there's a health insurance requirement, and then kind of trying to do an old school budget analysis. I know they don't teach people how to balance a checkbook anymore, but trying to do that activity or as close to an approximation of it as you can to really see what's being offered versus what's the ask. And then putting all of that information in conjunction with the context. A large scholarship award can be really, really appealing and alluring regardless of what the institution's cost is. So being sure that you take that large scholarship number in context with everything else you're getting.
And I think this harkens back to our previous sort of conversation about knowing your own individual budget, right? Like you can look at the cost of living in an area. If you're already living there and you've got a sweet deal on an apartment, maybe you're not going to be so off put by the cost of living in New York or San Francisco or wherever you're headed, versus, again, those relocation costs and getting an apartment and paying brokerage fees or whatever kinds of fees you're going to have to start that program. That's part of the analysis of what the total cost for the program is going to be for you. So if you're going to remain local, you don't have any of those relocation costs, that's a difference in comparing those programs to one another.
Yeah, and I just want to add that sometimes, like I applied to 2 schools, I applied to USC and Chapman's producing program. But when I really thought about it, I wanted to go to USC just because I'm from LA. Orange County is just really far and like just a different world. And so, but I was disappointed when I got into USC and I saw my scholarship package. I think they just gave me like $3,000, and they give really small scholarships, and I would just say, like, don't be discouraged by that, because sometimes leading up to you starting the program, more scholarship opportunities within the university can come up. So I learned like a month after getting in that there is a scholarship called the Norman Topping Scholarship, and they offer and I got into that program. And so every school year I've gotten $10,000 from that scholarship. And then also within the university, there have been other opportunities to keep getting funding. So if you do get like a disappointing scholarship package, just know that that's not like the end all be all. Like if you have your dream school and that's the school you truly want to go to, there are more opportunities to get funding to attend.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So I want to start kind of wrapping up before we open up the floor to questions. And I want to know, if you have any sort of final words of wisdom that you want to share with people that are thinking about how they're going to pay for graduate school, and especially for you, Chade, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would change about how you went about the process of applying for financial aid or, even paying for graduate school?
Yeah, I'll say like one thing that I did was set a goal. So USC, I think it's like over 50K a year to attend. And I just added that up and I was like, I do not want to be $100,000 in debt after I graduate this program. Especially going into the entertainment industry, when you're starting out, like it's harder to like make a lot of money or like to kind of really like pay off that debt. So I made a goal that I wanted to get 1 year fully funded. And so with that goal in mind, I just kept applying to scholarships. I took on teacher assistant positions. I took on a couple and that gave me like 5,000 for that semester. I applied to like affinity group scholarships within USC. So I got a Latino alumni scholarship. I think one thing I could have gone back and done was, I'm also half African American. I should have submitted to the Black alumni scholarship. But sometimes, these scholarship applications can be due like around midterms or when you just have like a lot of deadlines. So also just be kind to yourself. You can't meet a deadline because you're focusing on school. But I would just say that's one thing is like, just really like look for opportunities for funding. They are there. When I was an undergrad, I did not know anything about scholarships. And like looking back, I'm like, wow, I could have not graduated with debt, like especially in undergrad, because there are so many funding opportunities and ways to get free funding. So just really like keep looking out for them, especially within your university. If the program that you go to has a lot of funding and like scholarship programs.
I will subtle plug for employer assistance programs. I think that there are, if you choose to take time between, an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree, especially if you're interested in business school, a lot of corporate offices will pay for your business school, which I think is a great thing to think about. Doesn't mean that's why you should take the job or keep the job, but it is something to think about. I do also like to plug here about working on campus, whether that's like Chade said, teaching assistantships or working for the institution, dependent on what the expectations of your program are and what your own bandwidth are. That's how I got my graduate degree paid for. I worked for the university. So that's something to think about for tuition remission. And the last thing I'd probably say more than anything is ask for help. I think naturally we are very bad about asking for help and raising our hand when we need something. There are offices on your campus, whether it's a scholarship office, a fellowship office, financial aid, or your dean of students office. They're here and available to help you troubleshoot. They might not have all of the answers and they might not have the funding, but they can help point you in the direction of where you can look for it.
Absolutely. So there are people at every institution that you're considering who want to be a resource to you and want you to use them as the experts that they may be. So certainly reach out to those offices, understand that financial aid is built around a student budget, and that may vary significantly from what your actual budget is. So understanding that and looking at these programs with an eye to building a realistic cost for your situation and how that compares to the available funding sources that you have is certainly something that you should be mindful of as you approach this process. I think there are some sort of overlooked opportunities in terms of perhaps affinity associations, religious organizations, local charities, smaller organizations. During the pandemic, so many of these organizations completely stopped being able to fund anyone, and they're eager now to get back on course with giving out free money to people that is not in the form of a loan and maybe doesn't have all of the obligations that an employer benefit might have in terms of having to keep or stay with that employer for a period of time. But definitely use these institutional resources that are available. Lots of offices create databases for you for, again, awards that other students have already received in the past. And so we know that they're awarded to students within those populations.
Yeah, also I wanted to say that it's important to also advocate for yourself, and not be afraid to ask, like Sarah was saying, like raise your hand. I was working as a student assistant for a class that was a lot of work, and there was a TA, and there was just a little like imbalance of the work. I was really kind of carrying most of it. And so I just set up a meeting with my program, and I just told them, like, I think that it was a little unfair with how much money that this one student got with his position. Like, I feel like I should receive the same amount of scholarship money. And because I did that, they recommended me for another scholarship. And I got that scholarship, and I actually got like a refund to my account, and it kind of like helped me, is really helping me this semester just fund like my living expenses, and like invest in, you know, some of my film projects. So definitely advocate for yourself. And finally, I've talked a lot about, like, you know, not like, you know, using a lot of my savings or this and that, but I will say, like, going to grad school was one of the best, like actually the best decision I've made for myself. I am extremely like happy I chose to pursue my passion. I always wanted to get like an arts degree of some kind. And I kind of just like leaned into what I thought was my passion, and I truly discovered my passion. And I'm just like really excited, and despite the debt, I'm just so grateful that I was able to really find like where I should be, like what industry I should be working in.
I think that is a beautiful note to close on. So I want to close out part of the event, but I want to open it up to questions. What questions does the audience have for our panel of experts? Oh yes, Ginger, go ahead.
I was just wondering, so I just graduated, and I'm looking to continue my education in the social sciences, and I know there's sort of limited funding for humanities programs, and I'm sort of right now just trying to figure out how to go about looking for a program that is funded, or like, you know, trying to find funding for a program. And I guess I was wondering if any of you had advice about that process, just in terms of, would you recommend sort of finding programs and then looking for ways to fund those specific programs, or sort of finding funding opportunities and then sort of going that direction? Just because I was sort of like, in the research I've done so far, there's lots of institutions that say, you know, oh, apply and then we'll consider you for scholarships. We have certain amounts of money, but sort of like time and resources are not endless. So yeah, I would sort of, I'm looking to put my energy towards applications that I'm most likely to get the most support or most funding. And yeah, I was wondering if you all had advice about that.
Yeah, so I would start with the programs. For graduate study, it's important that you are in an institution that can support your ultimate goals. So that should be your driving point as you're searching for programs. So the faculty, the institutional resources, and the methodological approaches that are really going to ensure that your developing the skills and technicalities that you need to do whatever comes next. Especially in the social sciences and the humanities, you want to be in the place that matches your school of thought or is going to be the best possible location for you to do your work. I give people this example all the time. I work for the University of Chicago, but the University of Chicago is the absolute worst place for me to do the type of scholarship that I care about. I'm a children's literature scholar by training. We don't do that here. So even though our PhD programs are fully funded, I should never apply to the University of Chicago. It just isn't the right fit. So starting there is my first and foremost. The next plug that I always like to give is if you're interested in an institution, reach out to the people who have titles like mine, Director of Recruitment, Director of Admissions, for an application fee waiver. We give them away like candy. Seriously. It doesn't matter if you don't feel like you should have one or earn one. Most institutions have a ton of them and are happy to give them away because it shows that you actually want to apply. So don't let the application fee be the part that's hindering you from submitting an application. And hopefully those two things will kind of tip the scale towards like what's worth applying for if you remove a couple of those barriers. Also knowing that a lot of institutions won't consider you for financial aid until you've completed until you've completed the application process, because then you've demonstrated that you actually want to go there. So until you've started or completed an application, most institutions unfortunately won't even give you real numbers about how much the institution costs, not because they don't want to, but because it's kind of a little bit of a give and take. Yeah, that's that.
And I agree. I think you need to find a program because you could get admitted to a school that has an okay program that you kind of feel okay about, but is that what you want to do? Be okay? Like, no, this is not an investment in okay. This is an investment in something you really want to do. And I think if you find a place where there's a good fit, and then can build the financial plan around it, you'll be much happier with the result versus getting some funding together and then trying to find a program that fits the funding opportunities that you've gathered.
Yes, before I go to the question, I, definitely concur. Even if you get into a program and they give you 100% financial aid, if you're unhappy, that's still, years of your life, that you are investing. So definitely making sure that your academic needs are met, your professional needs are met, and that personal part that we've been talking so much about are met before, signing on to something. Silvana, you have a question?
I'm so sorry. My audio is like being really weird right now, so I don't know. Oh, wait, I can hear you now. Sorry, I was gonna ask about joint degree programs because I'm personally like really interested in getting a master's in public policy, but also I want to go to law school to get a JD. But both are like really expensive, and I heard that going into a program that allows me to do both at the same time would be more affordable. And I am wondering if you guys could tell me a little bit more about finding that right program and if it is a more affordable option.
Go ahead, Kate.
I mean, the answer is it depends, right? Like in some schools, it depends in part on how the joint degree is treated. Is it treated as a separate program that has its own funding where you are getting the JD and like an MPA at the same time? Or is it that you are admitted to each school separately and vary between those schools each semester or for a specific program track, and then each school determines the funding when you're at that school. That's how most dual and joint degree programs function in my experience. And so in some cases, if you've got two programs, one may be more challenging to be admitted to, like law, and finding a law school that's a good fit that you could then couple with another degree might be the way to go, but it will depend on the school and the program. To the idea that they may be less expensive than doing each degree separately will again depend on the program, because in some cases, while it's considered a dual degree and there may be overlap in academic requirements, you'll end up paying the same cost at an accelerated rate of time versus spreading that over a period of time. So there may not be an actual cost difference in many of those dual or joint degree programs. So it's something to explicitly ask for those programs that you're considering.
Yeah, I would I completely agree with Kate. And in addition to that, when students are interested in dual degree programs, I always ask them why and what the purpose of getting the dual degree is versus one degree or the two degrees separately. If your purpose for looking at dual degree programs is cost savings, I would discourage you from looking at dual degree programs because I don't think they're going to meet your goals, both in terms of cost savings, but I also think that their dual degree programs are very rigorous, and you have the same requirements that you would have in each program independently, just together, and you still have to do all of them, especially for a law program where there's an accreditation and an additional outside board involved. So I would encourage you to really reflect on why you're interested in that type of program, in addition to reaching out to the variety of dual degree programs that exist and asking them what their program requirements are and at what point are you the student of what department or what program, to kind of help logic your way through that.
Do we have any other questions today? Okay, sounds like you all have covered all the bases. So I want to thank you all and give you a moment if you want to, well, I'm going to stop recording.